All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm here in my office, so you'll hear sounds coming from outside. I'm not going to show you my office because I'm so embarrassed by how messy it is. But I'm here in Lake Huron Hall, looking out over the Osable Edition, and they're making pretty good progress. What I want to talk with you about today is chunking. So this is something that's discussed in chapter 4 a little bit, but I wanted to give you some of the theory behind it and also show you kind of how it works in English and how it works in Latin. So it's a little bit of a strange word, but chunking is a word that is used in linguistics and in cognitive research on reading processing, so language processing. And it tends to be used to refer to the habit of grouping words into units of sense. So within longer unit of sense, words go together to form their own smaller units of sense. It depends on the expectations for what will appear in a sentence. And in fact, you're doing it right now. When you're comfortable in a language, this kind of chunking always happens very, very quickly, like at fractions of a second. But when you're working in a foreign language, it is a lot harder and it takes a lot more brain power and it tends to be a bit slower. And that's why when you learn a modern foreign language, really the first thing you should learn is please slow down. Where is the bathroom is a good one to learn too, but if you can't understand what they're saying, you need to ask them to slow down. Theta attachment principle is another principle in cognitive processing theory that sort of gives an explanation for why chunking and why expectations are important as you're reading. You use them all the time, but understanding why when you're already familiar with the language can sometimes help make the extra effort a little bit more worth it. So the theta attachment principle suggests that the brain associates very clear expectations generated by words, or a very clear set of options generated by words. And if those expectations are violated somehow, there's a strain on the brain, or there's a shutdown in the cognitive centers that process language. And there's really great experiments at Carnegie Mellon and in other places that show that you can actually just make a brain stop processing language by putting too much stress on it. Not physical stress, but sort of processing stress. So here's an example in English of how this works. When we look at the, we tend to expect a noun, right? So if the sentence goes along and I'm giving words with every new slide, right? Once we get our noun, which is what we'd expect after the article the, we really in English want a verb next. In the sentence that we have, however, we have a relative pronoun. So this wasn't really what we might have expected, right? But it's still acceptable. It's actually one of those acceptable options for the sentence that we may not have had in our mind right away. But we really need that verb next for the relative pronoun, right? And there we do, we get it, right? What we expect next, I think, most people would say, is we either have some kind of adjective, the man who is happy or something, or some kind of noun, the man who is the construction worker or whatever. This thing that comes after the verb to be with a subject is sometimes called the predicate. So what we get next in the sentence is actually the word my. Now my is not a noun. It is an adjective, but it's not modifying who. It's a possessive adjective, and we really, really want a noun now. And there it is, the man who is my friend. Right? Friend is that noun we were waiting for. My modifies friend. The whole thing, my friend, which we can chunk together, is the predicate for who is. But we're still expecting something for the man. That expectation has not gone away. What was it we were expecting? Well, we were expecting a verb. I feel a little bit like Dora the Explorer. But there's our verb, gave. The man who is my friend gave. What do we expect now, right? Or maybe our sentence is done. We can have a period. Well, it's not really done, and no one who's familiar with English would suggest that that is done. unless it was in a really specific context, like you're talking about donations or something. The man who is my friend gave. But normally, our sentence would continue. So we wanted a noun after gave, right? And what we probably wanted, what I probably would have got as a response from all of you, was that we needed an object, the thing that was given. But we might also have expected, and you may even have thought, sort of explicitly in your head, well, we're going to get an indirect object, the receiver of the giving, because this is very common with the word gave, just as it is in Latin with the word do, dare. So which is this? What is me? Is it the object or is it the indirect object? I bet most of you would have thought me was the indirect object, right? And in fact, in our sentence, it is. But if instead of a pen, we had to the police, right? Our expected understanding of me as the object would have changed, right? And or as the indirect object would have changed, and we would have had to think that it was the direct object, the thing that was given. So the sentence in red there, the man who is my friend gave me to the police, right? Me then becomes the object to the police is the indirect object. All right, so what happens when it all goes wrong? Now, English for ESL learners is a notoriously difficult language to learn because there are all sorts of ambiguities that stress our processing. Now, we're used to them and we deal with them because English is, I think for everybody here, the first language, right? Or at least a well-learned language. One kind of ambiguity is a kind of sentence called garden path sentences. And these build a certain expectation and then sort of crush it, sometimes really violently. They're very hard to understand sometimes. People often fight against the idea that they make sense. And the difficult thing is that for us as we're learning Latin, almost every Latin sentence will be a garden path sentence if we're not paying attention to expectations. And because this is true, what happens when we read a Latin sentence or when we read one of our English garden path sentences is that there's stress in our processing centers, and sometimes we'll just shut down. Right, our brains will refuse to make sense of the words, or brains will refuse to make sense of what we know is there, and will make those words have some kind of sense. Right, it may not be the sense that's actual, but sense that just is going to work for our brains. Right, our brains are actually pretty lazy and like to make sense of stuff in the easiest way possible. We have to fight that. And the way we fight it is by building expectations in a correct way. So, want to see an example of garden path sentences? I'll lead you through one. There are many, many out there on the web. Linguists collect these things. So if you were to Google garden path sentences, you get a bunch of sites that have them. Some of them are actually kind of fun and funny. Some of them will just blow your brain. So, well, what do we expect? Well, we expect a noun, right? The horse. What do we want next? Well, theta attachment principle would suggest that what we most want next is a verb. The horse raced. The horse raced past. Well, that's okay. The horse raced past the... need another noun, right? The horse raced past the barn. Sentence over. The horse raced past the barn fell. Now, at this point, many of you are probably saying that sentence does not make any sense. I'll just give you a second with it again. The horse raced past the barn fell. If I were to say it differently, however, we'd have no trouble. This kind of sentence pattern is actually quite common in English and very much in newspapers, and it's notorious for causing trouble for ESL learners. Technically, this kind of sentence is called a subject-relative sentence. And it causes confusion because our instinct for the expectation of a main verb, right, after an initial subject is so strong most people can't defeat it. The theta attachment principle would explain this as such a strong attachment that the cognitive processing power required to break raced from being a main verb is just too much for most people. So you still may not believe that the sentence up there makes sense. But if I change it and fully express that relative, the horse which was raced past the barn fell, then it's totally fine, right? And if you think about how many times you hit this in English, you might be kind of surprised. In other contexts, it's less confusing. So the sentence below, the senators convicted of fraud went to jail, there it's okay, right? Because convicted of fraud definitely links it to senators, and we're all all right with it. But raced is ambiguous. It could be a past tense main verb, or it could be that participle in English. Okay, so what actually went wrong while we were reading the sentence? Well, we attached things too soon. Now, we can't stop ourselves doing this. It's part of how we process language. But we can pay attention to it in Latin because we're not attaching things, right? None of us are, right? I am, but I've been reading Latin for over 20 years. So we also chunked improperly. So the proper chunking of that sentence is the horse fell with raced past the barn connected as its own chunk, and past the barn inside that chunk. All right, does everyone see that? It's kind of interesting to think about sentences this way, right? We are automatically doing this. The brain is just an amazing, amazing thing. Now, Latin works exactly the same way as English does, right? Because your brain is pretty much exactly the same brain that a Roman would have had. But the expectations for the language are built on something different. They're built on cases and their case functions and on a principle called agreement, right? This is how you know words go together, like a subject and a verb agreeing in number. This idea of agreement will get really important next chapter, but for now, really the subject and the verb are the only place we need that. So we have to learn new expectations. If you look at the sentence at the bottom of the screen, in oculis animus habitat, we translate that as the spirit lives in the eyes, but it's actually two separate chunks, in oculis, in the eyes, and animus habitat, the spirit lives. We then have a subject-verb chunk and a prepositional phrase chunk. So before you go on to try this in exercise 30 and submit it through SafeAssign, it might be worth sort of reviewing what kind of chunks we have. So for now, our chunks up to chapter 4 consist mostly of the subject and the verb, of an object, of an indirect object, an ablative of means, prepositional phrases, which would be the preposition plus its noun, and the complementary infinitive that would be grouped with its verb, and the adverb, which would also be grouped with its verb. Okay, so in the example below, in saxo post casam o pueri sedete, so on the rock past the house, o boys, sit, an imperative, we can see 4 chunks. In saxo, post casam, o pueri, and sedete. 2 prepositional phrases, a vocative phrase, and the verb with the subject implied, as it is for the imperative. All right, now this can be a lot of fun if you like puzzles, Sudoku, crosswords, find the words, whatever. You may enjoy this a great deal. It is a really good exercise to practice, and I encourage you to practice it on every Latin sentence you approach, word by word, taking it into chunks and thinking about how the chunks make sense together, and then combine as chunks to make a sentence. Pretty soon I'll put up another screencast, like the ones I did for chapter 3, going through a bunch of sentences, evaluating the possibilities and expectations that each word raises. I encourage you to play around with that, to go through it, maybe to try to figure stuff out once that sentence comes up. Pause the video, try to figure it out yourself, and then I'll lead you through an analysis of the sentence. All right, don't forget to ask questions. Don't forget to post on the discussion board with questions. And if you find this kind of thing helpful, then please do tell me, and I'll do more of it. All right.